Tonight on Under Investigation,
It's such a lonely place.
Australia's Hitchhiker's Highway.
I consider it as a place of opportunity.
In the mind of a predator, this is a great landscape.
A desolate strip of road littered with secrets and savagery.
In those days, if you get into somebody's car and nobody sees you, you just vanish.
Now, we'll investigate the disappearance of Tony Jones,
This was the adventure of a lifetime.
who took a one-way ride into the night and never came back.
Put the body in the back of the ute and took it to the slaughter yards.
That's the starting point that you're looking for.
Tonight, with our panel of experts, we'll find out what really happened.
After 30 years of a vacuum, suddenly the story picks up again.
Good evening, I'm Liz Hayes, and this is Under Investigation. Joining me in the studio, Jim Slade, former Queensland detective with the Bureau of Criminal Intelligence. Leading criminologist Dr. Susanna Fay from the University of Queensland and expert on place-based crime. Matthew Condon, Queensland author and journalist who's covered the Tony Jones case. And Mark Jones, who has waged a 40-year campaign to find his brother's killer. The Flinders Highway, an 800-kilometre artery that supplies life to outback Queensland. It stretches from Townsville on the coast to Mount Isa deep in the interior. But while it may be the lifeline for central Queensland, it's also a highway with a disturbing reputation. Between 1970 and 2018, 11 people have gone missing or have been murdered along this remote ribbon of bitumen. Matt, can you explain this part of the world to us, this area which seems to have claimed so many lives?
It's northern Queensland, it's eerie, I've travelled it myself, and the hollowness, the terror, this is a sort of place that can take you away, where you can disappear.
And Jim, you do know this area quite well.
Yes, Liz. It's remote, isolated, very, very lonely. And at the time of the year that Tony went missing, it would have been between 35 and 37 degrees average. And then at night, of course, and this is what was a big draw card to backpackers, the heavens just open up to the millions of stars, which just give an ambience which you'll never, ever forget for the rest of your life.
And he was, Mark, on the adventure of a lifetime.
He was.
Tony was Mark's kid brother, the youngest in a large and loving Perth family of 5 brothers and 3 sisters. They were incredibly close and expected Tony home by Christmas, when he would reunite with his longtime girlfriend Natalie and settle back into his job as a technician at a radiology company.
This was a young Australian's dream, to be travelling not just up the east coast, but back across the top, back to Perth, where he was going to walk into the family home at Christmas. This truly was, yes, a trip of a lifetime.
Long before Uber, hitchhiking was the original rideshare. A young person, a backpack and a thumb stuck out to signal they were ready to hit the road. 20-year-old Tony Jones was one of thousands of young Australians who left home for his generation's version of extreme adventure, hitchhiking around the country. Matt, would you have hitchhiked back then? You're the local, you're the Queenslander.
Yes, I would have. It was everywhere. It was a mode of transport. I mean, it's heartbreaking to sit here at this table with these images of this young man at the start of his life, doing what so many of his contemporaries did and not coming home. It was not even considered, whereby you were risking your personal safety.
And did
It was
anyone
the thing to
hitchhike,
do.
by the way?
Well, yes, I did, yeah. If you wanted to travel, you couldn't afford the airfares, so the only way to get there was to put a pack on and do it.
But in many ways, young hitchhikers exploring the paradise of North Queensland in the 1970s and 80s were walking innocently into a perfect storm. They were outsiders, obvious targets for evil men.
They were very easily identified. They were all happy. They were all bubbling. One, they'd left their families behind, the people that usually look after them. But secondly, there was this draw of making new friends and seeing new places. So the minute that these people would have gone along the Flinders Highway, they would have been identified straight away.
Two of those hitchhikers were Melbourne teenagers, 18-year-old Robin Hoynville-Bartram and 19-year-old Anita Cunningham. Lured by adventure, the pair were determined to thumb their way from Melbourne to Bowen in far north Queensland, a 2,500-kilometre trip. They set off in July 1972, a trip that would take them along the Flinders Highway. 4 months later, Robin's remains were found in a shallow grave under a bridge 80 kilometres from the outback town of Charters Towers. She had been raped and shot in the head with a .22 calibre rifle. Anita is still missing. Their case remains unsolved. It is a place that has components that make it dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely.
Probably wouldn't be very easy to pick up something out of the ordinary. Lots of outsiders.
Criminologist Dr. Susanna Fay believes crimes occur in certain places for many reasons. On the Flinders Highway, isolation, she says, is only one factor.
One of the things that's really interesting about this area, the prevalence of firearms, the kinds of activities that are considered normal in that area, certainly is an interesting component of understanding these places and the kinds of behaviour that would be considered normal.
Jim?
I consider it as a place of opportunity. So if somebody, even if they hadn't planned to do what they did, there's the sort of person that will see an opportunity and take it. And this place adds to his feeling of safety because there's no witnesses. He feels safe operating that. If he's a local, he's very comfortable working in that very remote situation.
So many lives, so many young people, murdered or missing.
It was meant to be the motorcycling trip of a lifetime, but it ended in a triple murder.
Victims like 23-year-old Karen Edwards, 31-year-old Gordon Twaddle and 21-year-old Timothy Thompson on a motorcycle adventure through Queensland in 1978, who were found shot to death at Spear Creek near Mount Isa. And others before and after, from young girls to single men. Most of those who met tragedy here were strangers in a strange land.
Particularly in the 70s and 80s, this is kind of the highest point of Australian violent crime. And I do think that we continue to come back to this kind of crime of opportunity. You do have these tight-knit communities, and so it's very possible that people will see things, but because outsiders coming through is somewhat normal, they may not even realise what they've seen.
If you look at this highway, if you're a predator, how does it look to you? It's opportunity. It's people that aren't locals, that are strangers. They can be taken, snatched. The possibility of a witness is almost impossible because of the remoteness. So to my mind, thinking in the mind of a predator, this is a great landscape.
The Flinders Highway, a desolate strip of road through the Queensland outback. And a one-way ride for 11 young people who were murdered or disappeared between 1970 and 2018. Tonight we'll reveal new evidence in the case of 20-year-old Tony Jones. It's October 1982. Tony has hitchhiked all the way from his hometown of Perth to Townsville in North Queensland. He has been in constant touch with his family, including his older brother, Mark. Mark, the messages you were getting back from Tony as he was taking this trip were that people were very friendly.
Absolutely, yeah. These were great times of meeting new people and forming very instant bonds.
Yeah, well, and camaraderie. There's a lot of camaraderie on the road.
Absolutely, yeah.
It was a more innocent time when hitchhiking was just another mode of transport, and young men like Tony, a lovable larrikin with a trusting nature, gave little thought to its risks. But the dangers were real, even then, according to criminologist Dr. Susanna Fain.
You're an outsider, you're travelling to an area that you don't know very well and often don't know people in that area, which limits your ability to ask for help, to know where to go to get help. Those things in and of itself create vulnerabilities around that activity.
By November 1982, Tony was ready to hit the road again. He planned to hitchhike from Townsville to Mount Isa, 800 kilometres west along the Flinders Highway, to meet his brother Tim, who was exploring Australia on pushbike. The last time Tony Jones was seen was in Townsville on the 3rd of November 1982. That day, he made his last bank withdrawal, and in the evening, Tony made his last call to his childhood sweetheart, Natalie. And while talking to Natalie from this telephone box that night, Tony shared an important detail. In that phone call, he said that he'd shaved off his beard.
Yes, that turned out to be a critical piece of information because to that point he was sporting quite a bushy, bushrangers type thick beard.
Without his distinctive beard, Tony looked very different.
We gave this photo to the police with the full beard, thinking that that's what Tony looked like. And it was only days or a week or so after that we spoke to his girlfriend, and she said, oh no, he hasn't got the beard.
Jim Slade, as a police officer, how important is that information?
Oh, vital information.
Despite giving police a new picture, 40 years later, inexplicably, the official missing persons photo still features Tony with a beard. Tony hangs up from his girlfriend, telling her he'll be back in Perth by Christmas. Then shortly after 9 p.m, he walked 2 kilometres down the road to hitch a ride at the intersection of the Flinders Highway. It is dark and it is dangerous. But on a mission to meet with his brother Tim in Mount Isa, Tony vanishes into the night.
We're quite sure he set out that night. It hadn't been his habit. I think he just envisaged he'll be on his truck tonight, he'll be in Mount Isa in the morning.
It was something that most of the hippies and the backpackers steered clear of. They wouldn't go at night.
So that might have been a fatal decision by Tony.
It may well have, yep.
Just simply going out at night.
Yep, and just being picked up by that wrong person and going into that area, being so lonely and so remote with no witnesses.
In those days, Liz, whether it was day or night, you know, in that pre-digital era, if you get into somebody's car and nobody sees you step into that car, well, you just vanish. If something goes wrong, there's no clue. So that's the danger.
Believing Tony was heading for Mount Isa, the family awaited his next contact. They knew, at the very least, Tony would call on November the 11th. It was an unmissable family date, the day Tony's mother had narrowly saved him from suffocating in an old fridge as a child.
It became a day that was, you know, a private thing between a mother and son. They always spoke to each other no matter where they were on that day, and they always thought of each other. So for that day to come and go was a big moment, particularly for my mother. She knew that Tony could have crawled to a phone box. He would have rung her on that day.
But November the 11th came and went without a word from Tony. His family raised the alarm with Queensland Police, but the response was lukewarm.
They weren't taking it seriously. Your brother's out hitchhiking and you haven't heard from him for a couple of days. They didn't get it. And understandably, to some extent.
Well, is it understandable? I guess it's the era, a lot of hitchhiking, and with total respect, I guess the police did think he'll turn up.
Yeah, sadly, that's exactly right. With the missing person, there is no body, there is no crime scene, there is no emotion, which is needed to get the police going in that first important week of any investigation.
That first week is vital, isn't it, Matt?
Absolutely. And, it's terrible for the Jones family, and they know this better than anybody, but it goes beyond a week even, and the diminishing returns are, incalculable. It's just, it narrows to the point of almost nothingness.
What can be lost in that time frame?
Well, the whole scene of the crime, virtually. In any investigation, if you can start tracking the line of the crime, that's when you start getting your witnesses. And if the questions are asked correctly, they then give you information which allows you to make further inquiries.
But the other thing that I think you really do miss when that time drags on is people are less likely to be able to think about what they might have seen, even if they initially thought it was irrelevant. As time drags on, they're less and less likely to be able to identify something that might be helpful. So that week really is very critical.
With police still not taking Tony's disappearance seriously, his mother contacts his bank to see if there have been any recent transactions.
Mum had put $150 into Tony's account. It was untouched. Tony only had $4 in his account and he hadn't touched the 150, and this was now 8 or 9 days later.
When the call comes from Tony's bank, the news is devastating.
Somebody else took the phone call from the bank manager when he rang back, wrote down the recent transactions, and Mum came in and saw them, and it may as well have said that Tony's dead.
Mark, his mother, and Tony's 2 other brothers fly to Townsville with dread in their hearts.
Liz, we all stepped onto that plane knowing we weren't finding Tony alive. These indicators were so strong.
Now we're talking about a family who's turned up saying, we think our son is dead. Our brother is dead. As a police officer?
It still hadn't got to the stage where there was a crime coordinator or there was an operational room or an incident room. It was still in the ether at that particular time. If there's no body, you haven't got that emotional drive to go that extra yard and to really put your effort into that investigation.
I would have thought that the emotion of the family would have been enough to drive that, is my first gut reaction.
Well, a mother turns up.
Yeah.
Can you see that picture in the police station?
Yes, I can. I've spoken to many people related to missing persons, and they've discussed the initial period. And there has been, right or wrong, an indifference by authorities. It's almost like, well, they're missing. Let's wait and see what turns up, as in they're not going straight into homicide mode.
Well, at what point do you go?
Well, it doesn't become serious until you get either physical evidence or belongings. You either get a witness that comes forward and can absolutely identify that person, then you've got a starting point.
Feeling the desperate pressure of time slipping away, the Jones family was willing to do anything required to help in the search for Tony, but there was little police support.
We did feel alone. You know, if an investigating team decide to keep the family at arm's length and they miss vital clues, then they're going to make mistakes.
But there is something really important to be said about the relationship that the police has with families and their onus to communicate what's going on behind the scenes, because this is the family that's still having to deal with the fallout from the disappearance or the homicide. And so I think that humanity is missing from this, and I think that's the part that's really disappointing.
Expert in place-based crime, Dr. Susanna Fay believes another factor could have played into the police attitude in the immediate days and weeks following Tony's disappearance. The feeling that, as a hitchhiker, he'd put himself at risk.
Am I right in understanding that some victims just do get more attention than others?
Absolutely. So,
And why is that?
well, in criminology, we talk about it as there are victims that appear to be more worthy than others. So people engaging in risky behaviour often drop to be a lower priority. And some of that could be for very practical reasons, as in the eyewitness statements aren't going to be particularly reliable, perhaps, or there isn't enough information. But it is a common understanding that there are some victims that are likely to receive less attention.
After a fortnight in Townsville, spending money they didn't have, Mark Jones and his family reluctantly returned home to Perth.
The police said to us, look, go home. There's nothing you can do here. We'll handle it. We'll keep in touch. And that was the first great lie of the investigation. We went home to a phone that never rang. And just everything, the steam went out of the whole thing. It was a fatal decision. That was the end of the investigation.
November the 3rd, 1982. We're investigating the case of 20-year-old Tony Jones, who vanished while hitchhiking from Townsville in North Queensland to Mount Isa along an infamous stretch of the Flinders Highway, a place where so many other young travellers have gone missing or have been murdered. Few of those cases were ever solved, and our experts believe there may be a disturbing reason for that. And much of it has to do with a failure by police to employ proper resources and manpower to their investigations.
Tony Fitzgerald was the face of truth and justice against entrenched corruption.
In the 1980s, Queensland's Fitzgerald Inquiry,
accused of paying tens of thousands of dollars in bribes,
exposed police corruption on a shocking scale.
Protection of illegal casinos, prostitution, SP bookmakers and sex shops.
Starting right at the top.
After 2 years of allegations and denials, Queensland's former top policeman came to face justice with a smile.
Good morning.
And former Queensland detective Jim Slade, who's part of tonight's under-investigation team, spoke out at the time.
Last week, Detective Jim Slade told the Commission he'd heard the two were linked to corruption.
This dark network of corruption, he believes, meant the force was distracted, and cases like that of Tony Jones lost focus.
It was a terrible time for the Queensland Police. You can imagine that this floats down to the stage where the sergeants in charge of police stations got to the stage where it's them or us, you know, like I've got to look after my backside. And that feeling just went right through the police.
Unfortunately for people like Tony and many others, there was this sort of tank stream of foul water sitting under everything. You can see the stress and strain that was happening through the length and breadth of that particular year, 1982. So you suddenly have officers that should be putting their time into solving cases are actually spending the bulk of their time protecting their corrupt assets and their involvement in it.
I was just pissed off and so angry. Firstly, I was pissed off that members of the police force, of which I was a member at that time, completely disregarded their oath of office and their pledge and didn't follow through with the promise that they made to look after the members of the public, including Tony and his family, and to protect them. That didn't happen.
With the Queensland Police investigation into Tony's disappearance going nowhere, his family conducted their own. And to keep the case high in the public's mind, Tony's brother Brian wrote a book about their search. The book maps Tony's last movements and makes a heartfelt plea for a more thorough investigation. For 2 decades, the family pushed for a coronial inquest. Finally, in 2002, a coroner made his findings, and in an extraordinary decision, directed police to read Brian Jones' book. To former Detective Jim Slade, it was a stunning indictment of the police work.
For the coroner to tell the police to read a book, quite incredible. Yeah, I have never heard of anything like that. And I suppose by that comment, he probably meant, you know, get some details of what you're trying to investigate.
It's ordinarily, it's the opposite, isn't it?
It is, yes.
So that it is an extraordinary moment there.
Susanna, what do you make of that?
I keep coming back to how much has been lost in advancing the investigation, to have to wait for family members to write a book about evidence that they've gathered on their own. I think that is quite striking in this case and highly unusual.
After hearing evidence, the coroner concludes that Tony is dead and that he died on or around the 3rd of November 1982 at the hands of a person or persons unknown. But Mark Jones and his family still need to find Tony. Ever since the inquest in 2002, they've continued looking. When they set up a Facebook page, new clues began trickling in.
It was hard to believe that for so long we had so little evidence, and now we had a pile of evidence so high we couldn't even imagine the top of it.
And then came a bombshell. 3 women came forward with extraordinary and shocking stories about one man and his accomplice. We won't name these men, but we know who they are, and so did police.
He said that, you know, he'd basically helped kill the guy.
Our informant, whom we'll call Julie, says she was the partner of the alleged accomplice, a violent man who subjected her to terrible abuse. Julie alleges that after those beatings, he confessed his involvement in a murder.
So the reason why he's like that is because when he was 17, he helped, you know, dispose of a body, and he told me, you know, how that happened and where it happened, and I'd ask him questions like, well, who was it then? And he said, I don't know, it was just some labourer or some backpacker. Nobody knows, nobody knew him.
Julie says he told her it happened in the town of Hughenden, on the Flinders Highway between Townsville and Mount Isa. A one-punch attack late at night after closing time in a pub called the Grand Hotel.
Well, basically, he said that his best mate had punched a guy at the Grand. His best mate was, you know, basically in a panic and said it was like a one-punch kill sort of a thing. And, you know, he needs help disposing of the bodies.
Julie alleges her partner told her he and his mate then took the body to Hughenden slaughter yards on the outskirts of town.
They put the body in the back of the ute and took it to the slaughter yards. He said he put it through a bandsaw and put it into, like he said, pits with like acid in it.
It was a confession, Julie says, she's heard many times. A story that never changed.
He saw the dust settle on this for decades. Finally felt free, finally felt this was long enough in the past that I can talk about it and the sky's not going to fall in. Once he started talking, he couldn't shut up.
Our witness's testimony is one that's been repeated by 2 other women who have spoken to the police and the family.
One of those women was also a former partner of the alleged accomplice.
Did that fortify your belief that this is true?
Yes, the 3 accounts are quite interesting because there are parts of the story that vary a little bit, and those parts are to do with how the body was disposed of, and it's almost like he's saying to each of them, yes, I'm getting this off my chest, but don't go looking for them because there's nothing to find. There are other consistencies in the story about who was involved, where it took place.
Susanna, does it make sense that somebody does confess like this?
I think that the point that Mark made, that the dust has settled and suddenly people can get particular things off their chest, we certainly have seen instances of that in the past. So I think that is definitely a possibility.
What do you make of this, Jim?
Look, after seeing that video, and if I was involved in the investigation, I would definitely recommend that we put extra staff onto that and to run every bit of that out. And probably where I would start would be to go back to what those people were like, how their behaviour was at the hotel, whether they were the type of people that started fights like that. So there's a lot of really good information which could be turned into evidence if you followed down that track.
And are drunken confessions reliable?
So whether or not drunken confessions are reliable, in the context of an investigation, I'd say follow it through anyway.
Like Susanna said, that's the gold. If you follow that through, that's the gold.
Starting point that you're looking for.
After 30 years of a vacuum, suddenly the story picks up again.
The Flinders Highway in outback Queensland takes another life. Hitchhiker, 20-year-old Tony Jones, is missing. But as we've revealed, now nearly 40 years later, witnesses have come forward with allegations of a confession that Tony was punched to death in a pub brawl.
His best mate was basically in a panic and said it was like a one-punch kill sort of a thing.
The pub, the Grand Hotel in Hughenden, has since been destroyed by fire. All that's left is a series of drunken confessions allegedly made by a man who says he helped the killer dispose of Tony's body at the local slaughterhouse. But it's the same drunken confession he is alleged to have made 3 times to 3 separate women.
Do you believe this is the truth now?
We've come to that. We've looked at the suspects, sort of people they are, their actions.
After all these years, this would have to be considered a breakthrough of some sort.
Oh, without a doubt. A major breakthrough.
And as you made the point, Matt, it's the family that's kept this rolling.
And that's proved the absolute crucial factor in recent successful cases. And, you know, I admire Mark. I've spoken to him over the years. The tenacity, passion of the family is phenomenal. The other situation is police being able to establish evidence sufficient and strong enough to be able to stand it up in a court of law. Now, that final objective, ironically, may be muddied because of the passage of time that was initiated because matters weren't taken as seriously from the outset.
If these men were involved, and both have strenuously denied they were, according to our experts, the one witness who could resolve this case is the primary suspect's alleged accomplice.
These suspects, one needs to turn on the other to put a new dimension to the case.
Whoever tells their story first gets to tell it on their terms. And they can go down together, or one can get out of it a little bit better than the other. That's up to them.
That fight in the pub, could there be other people out there that may still be capable of coming forward?
Absolutely. Someone was working there that night. That person hasn't been spoken to. So there may be people in that place that have heard something and either not associated it with Tony's case or just thought it was part of the town scuttlebutt.
Can I ask you, Susanna, I mean, how difficult is it in small communities for people to put their hand up?
Well, I think there's lots of different issues that contribute to this kind of problem. So small communities tend to be quite tight-knit. So it's difficult for people to come forward if they know that someone in that community could potentially be in trouble, no matter how poorly they've behaved.
Do you find that, Jim?
Oh, definitely. Any outside inquiries, these people just close the door and just don't want to be part of it because they've got to live in the community.
There is another piece of significant evidence which could help solve this case. A rifle carried secretly by Tony Jones in his backpack. A single action .22 calibre, its stock stained a distinctive rosewood colour. You had stained this yourself, I think.
I did. Tony had not long bought himself a rifle. He used to go and shoot a few rabbits with some mates around Perth. And for some strange reason, I decided that I'd pull it apart and restain the wooden stock a nice rosewood colour. So he took this thing apart and stored it away at the bottom of his backpack.
So that gun's got to be somewhere, Jim.
Well, it has, and I think the identification of that is very, very important because we've had a lot of amnesties, both in New South Wales and Queensland, and if that gun was ever handed in, it'd be most important to track that gun and to see if it was handed in, who did hand it in.
A description of it was widely publicised, but Tony's rifle has never been found. But a witness has come forward, contacting Mark with an astonishing allegation about the fate of Tony's gun, directly linking it to one of our main suspects.
The suspect turned up and gave a rifle to this man's son. And that description was in keeping with my memories of that gun.
We've confirmed with the witness that a gun matching the description of Tony's was given to his son, but he says the gun has since been lost.
Again, find the gun? Do you find a pathway to the truth?
That's right, yep. You've got a continuity of possession, which could actually be the bit that puts it all together.
And continuity of the people involved as well.
Yeah.
This is following the gun lead hasn't led to a range of different possible suspects. It's come back to the one that they currently have.
Matt, your thoughts on this?
Well, the gun, it's the glue in this that links to the suspect and thus goes back to Tony. So you have this through line of narrative, which makes complete sense.
Tonight's information has been passed on to Queensland Police, but so far there have been no new developments in the case.
What more should the police be doing then, if this is credible information?
Well, this is sort of building up into a crescendo after all of these years. And the information and the evidence that we've talked about at this table, I think is most important to absolutely follow that through and to turn that information into acceptable evidence for the court.
Like few other cases we've come across, the wheels of justice have ground incredibly slowly for Tony Jones and his family.
The 20-year-old disappeared while hitchhiking along the Flinders Highway in November 1982, a stretch of bitumen where 11 young men and women have gone missing, some known to have been murdered. Tony Jones' family keeps searching for answers. There's now been a second inquest, and the family awaits those findings.
There are still ways forward with this case. There have been flaws in it, and there are things still to investigate.
Based on the evidence we've revealed tonight, evidence gathered mainly through decades of persistence by the Jones family, this is what they believe has happened to Tony. He's been involved in a fight in or near the Grand Hotel in Hughenden. Tony Jones, clean-shaven as seen in this photo, is killed in that fight. It's believed 2 men carry him into the night.
And so you believe that is how Tony died?
I think that's the likely scenario.
Reviewing Tony's investigation, former Queensland detective Jim Slade believes police do have important information to follow.
This is sort of building up into a crescendo after all of these years. And the information and the evidence that we've talked about at this table today, I think is most important to absolutely follow that through and to turn that information into acceptable evidence for the court.
And all leads are being sought. So if you were a witness or know something about the allegations of a fight or the people involved, now is the time, finally, to come forward.
There are probably people out there with a memory, a moment, like 2 minutes of or a minute of film captured, buried in their memory, that can contribute to taking us back in time and assisting in that.
Absolutely. And you know, Matt, when a case gets to 10, 20, 30, 40 years later, that's what sparks memories and it sparks information and it fills out missing pieces.
Jim, from your perspective, and you're a former policeman and you know this area, you know how difficult these cases are, but perhaps that one person who must be able to tell us something.
That person that's got that fire in their gut. Yep.
And Matt, you've watched this case from the sidelines, you've reported on it, you've reported on police corruption. How do you sum up this time in history and Tony Jones' role in it?
For starters, I wouldn't presume to pretend to put myself in the shoes of Mark and his family, nor to be able to understand the extent and depth of the suffering that they've gone through. Hope never ends. That there are people out there that have information, and it's time to bring that information to the table to end the suffering for this family. Someone knows something, and it's time to do the right thing and bring it forward.
Tony remains a cherished family member, and like all families of victims, the Jones family wants to know how Tony's life ended, and just as importantly, where he is along the highway.
We'd like to be somewhere near an end point, but I fear that that's not the case. I know that we'll get more of the missing pieces, and I couldn't be there for Tony that night. But, I'm not going to abandon him now. We need to get justice.
As we've said, it only takes one person to come forward to help to solve this case. If you have information about Tony Jones or any of those we've mentioned tonight, please call Crime Stoppers on 1800 333 000. I want to thank you all very much for joining us, and thank you. I'm Liz Hayes. Good night. Hello, I'm Liz Hayes, and thank you for watching Under Investigation. Subscribe to our channel now for exclusive clips, and don't miss out on full episodes of Under Investigation on 9Now and the 9Now app.